All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals who are building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but to provide a platform for them to share insights to a more accessible world. Today, we are joined by Travis Pollen, an author, personal trainer, and assistant professor of exercise science at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. His research focuses on athletic injury etiology and risk reduction. He's particularly interested in pre-participation movement screening, return to sport testing, and training load, and the roles that these factors play in injury risk. In addition to his PhD in Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, Travis holds a master's in Biomechanics and Movement Sciences. Outside of academia, he's been a personal trainer since 2013 and has worked with a variety of clientele, from an Olympic hopeful to post-rehabilitation and older adults. He's also the co-founder of two companies, Strength for Yoga and ACL Care Pro. Athletically, he's previously held 2 American records in Paralympic swimming and recently returned to competitive swimming after a decade-long hiatus. Thank you for including a ton of words that were hard to pronounce in that bio to really just test how on the ball I'm going to be this episode.
You nailed them all.
I think so. Etiology, I don't know.
Either way, I think.
All right, so let's maybe start with a discussion on movement screening, since it's a topic that you are heavily involved in and have researched. So movement screens imply that there is one universal norm for movement that all individuals should be working towards or that they should be compared against. And that would be inaccessible for a lot of people with disabilities. And obviously the nature of this podcast is on inclusion and accessibility. So one challenge with physical therapy as a whole is the medicalized model. And so maybe can we discuss how a movement, like what role a movement screen plays in maybe like a social model approach to exercise, if that makes sense? Or maybe we can start with just defining what a movement screen is and looking at the barriers of it.
Yeah, so this is an awesome question because it definitely applies to people with disabilities, but it also applies to all people, or it, like you said, a movement screen is this battery of tests, often multiple tests, that is supposed to grade and rank human fundamental movement patterns. So there are a lot of different ones out there. The most popular one is probably the functional movement screen, which is a series of 7 tests. And it'll look at things like squats and lunges or split squats. It might look at push-ups. And so those would kind of be like what you would call the fundamental movement patterns. And then it also looks at things like core stability, looks at range of motion, flexibility, mobility, and it attempts to compare you to some sort of norm, or not even really a norm, but someone's opinion of what a norm should be. And so it says, okay, here's the criteria to which we want all people to move, or range of motion or whatever. And so it'll say, okay, you meet our standard or you don't. And it kind of, and that's like kind of preposterous, right off of the base of it, because people move differently, right? And so to say, well, this is the way that we think that all people should move. They need to stand with their feet hip width apart and toes forward and squat down till their hip crease goes below their knee, keeping their torso vertical with a dowel rod overhead. It's like, okay, if you can do that, that's wonderful. But if most people can't do that, and that doesn't mean that there's actually anything wrong with them for many reasons. That movement might not be relevant to them. That particular setup might not work for them because that's not the way that they do the exercise. They haven't practiced it that way. Or their unique anatomy, limb length ratios, whatever, dictates that they need to do it differently. And so when you're talking about people with disabilities, adaptive athletes, clearly not everybody's going to move the same way. But even when you're talking about people without disabilities, people are not going to move the same way. And so do we really want to pathologize that and tell people that hey, you're dysfunctional, quote unquote, based on these arbitrary criteria we've laid out for these arbitrary movements? Or is that potentially detrimental? Does that not really do anything helpful for us besides getting people to subscribe to a, you know, a 10-week training program where I'm going to supposedly correct these dysfunctions? I use air quotes for all of these words. So long answer short, it doesn't apply to most people without disabilities. It definitely doesn't apply to people with disabilities who, have so many different ways that they move, none of which we should really pathologize, or very few of which we should really pathologize, because people find ways to get the job done. And so it's whenever you create this cookie cutter thing and say everybody has to do these 7 movements this exact way, you wind up making just a kind of
more barriers.
Yeah, adding huge barriers, and then it goes to even farther to say, well, okay, if you can't do the squat with the dowel rod overhead, then we're not going to have you squat. And it's like, whoa, that's a gross. We're going to have you do all of these quote unquote corrective exercises before you squat, and now you're not able to give people a sufficient exercise stimulus because you're trying to help them improve their internal hip rotation or whatever it is, when you could just find the version of the squat or whatever movement it is that is best suited for them in this moment. Maybe that's a squat with TRX support. Maybe that is a squat to a box. Maybe it's a squat using band assistance. Whatever it is, there's usually a way that you can find to adapt the exercise to the individual, as opposed to trying to fit the individual to your arbitrary standard and not allow them to do the exercise until they can meet that criteria.
Yeah, the pathologizing of movement, I think, is the biggest issue, and the associated kinesiophobia that could come with exercising, just from, I think oftentimes it's a personal trainer wanting to demonstrate that they have this unique skill set, or they need to create a problem in order to provide a solution. So someone comes with you, and if they can squat and they can press and they can row, then you have to demonstrate some other way, I guess, that you're going to improve them. And then you convince them that they need to be able to overhead squat, and then a half of your session is being taken up by low-level mobility drills to try to get to that.
And they don't even want to overhead squat. They didn't even come to you expressing that goal. It's different if they're an Olympic lifter, CrossFitter who wants to do overhead squats. And it's still, well, maybe they don't need to perform it to that standard. There's this great side-by-side of Dmitry Klokov,
right? Yeah, I've seen that,
Olympic medalist in Olympic lifting, looking pretty substandard according to the FMS's criteria when he does the FMS deep squat. And then they flash to him doing a snatch with 300 pounds. And it's suddenly when you throw on Olympic weightlifting shoes and allow him to self-select his stance, and you put 300 pounds over his head instead of an empty dowel rod, he performs this movement beautifully as one of the best in the world.
Yeah, so the addition of load completely alters how someone moves.
Right, which is another nail in the coffin for it, because it's well, we're testing all these things with your body weight and moving slowly, and that is a totally different context from the weight room or the athletic court or field. Yeah. So, maybe you actually move better when you throw some weight on, right? Because it, a goblet squat, gives you a little bit more of a counterbalance so that you can stay more upright. So if the goal is to have somebody do a goblet squat and they do a nice goblet squat, then they're good. They can do goblet squats. They don't have to be able to do an unweighted squat or an overhead squat. So it's what we have to match the test, or whatever you want to call it, the assessment process, to the individual, and not some arbitrary cookie cutter thing.
So then how do we go about doing that? So I mean, the literature is pretty strong that the FMS, the improvements are often just made through practicing the movements that they test, and that they don't necessarily carry over to injury prevention. So how can we screen new clients more effectively, or what should we be looking at in that first session?
So my process is basically thinking about the different movement patterns that I would want to work within a session or within a program, and thinking about each of those movement patterns on a continuum of unloaded or assisted up to body weight, up to added load. So, different people will have different fundamental movement patterns in their list, but it would be things like squatting and lunging, pushing, pulling, hinging, bridging, rotating, carrying, maybe, if you wanted to add that category. So my process would be, okay, I have each of these movement patterns, and then I have what I would consider to be like the baseline version of that movement pattern. So a goblet squat, a kettlebell deadlift, whatever. And I would try to identify the point along each of the movement continuums, or each of the continuums of each movement pattern, that person is currently prepared for. So can they do a goblet squat? If not, do they need to do a squat to a box, a squat with assistance? Can they do a push-up, or do they need to do some sort of push-up regression, push-up on an incline, a push-up with band assistance, a kneeling push-up, an eccentric push-up? Or maybe they can do a push-up, regular flat on the ground, and they can do 20 of them. Well, that means we could put a plate on their back or give them band resistance. So it's about identifying the point on that continuum from unloaded to body weight to added load for each of the movement patterns. And that kind of tells me, okay, this is where the person's at, and this is kind of the general level that they're at across these different movement patterns. And then I can probably surmise within other exercises, single joint exercises, accessory exercises, whatever, kind of where they're going to be based on what I find. So it's not like you're broken, you're dysfunctional. It's just, here's where you're at right now. And sure, maybe we would like to get everybody moving with their body weight and all of those movement patterns, or moving with added load, but it's kind of more of a neutral thing of just identifying where you are, as opposed to saying, oh, you can't do this yet, or you are exhibiting some sort of movement compensation or dysfunction. Like, those words aren't even in the vocabulary.
It sounds like that's basically just a traditional workout. Like, the assessment's basically just taking them through a workout and then trial and error.
It can be exactly that. Like, it doesn't have to occur in a context of, hey, this is our first session and I'm going to run you through a test today. It can just be, okay, here are the basic movement patterns, and maybe it occurs over 2 sessions instead of 2, because maybe that would be a lot to do depending on the person in the day. But yeah, I'm gonna guess where you're at. Maybe that's starting with the most regressed version, or maybe that's like an assisted version of all of these different exercises, or maybe it's starting with the kettlebell version of each of them. Ideally, you wanna guess right so that they meet with success in the initial encounter. Not, hey, I'm going to put you through this overhead squat, this push-up, and this lunge on a tightrope balance beam that you can't do any of these things. I'm going to make you feel really bad about yourself, and then I'm going to show you my value is in helping to correct you to get to be able to do these arbitrary things. It's not that at all. It's just, hey, your goblet squat looks great. We're going to be able to add weight on that over the next few weeks. But so trying to find the thing that they can do off the bat, as opposed to, oh, that doesn't look good. Let's try to rewind you to a more basic version. Some people would do fine with that, but some people might get discouraged with that. So starting on the easier side, showing them everything that they can do, that's like a really empowering thing, right? And for able-bodied or adaptive, and running from there.
Yeah, so goals of an assessment: have the client leaving feeling confident and capable, identifying what their goals are, and maybe what exercises and movement patterns are most relevant for them achieving those goals. Again, if they need to lose a lot of weight, then overhead squat assessment isn't super relevant because the majority of your workout is not going to consist of trying to improve your overhead squat. So
Right.
yeah.
And I appreciate what you said, and that step even precedes, if one of those movement patterns is totally not relevant to the person, then we don't have to do it. So if they, like, somebody might tell me, oh, I'm not interested in deadlifting for whatever reason, and I might take issue with that because I might think deadlifts would be great for that person, but maybe at first I acknowledge that they are not interested in deadlifting, and maybe we skip that one. Maybe later on I have them do a sumo squat that's actually a deadlift to try to violate that preconceived notion. But really it is about assessing them in a way that's going to match their goals. So whatever those goals are, choosing the most relevant assessments to get them matched up with their goals, as opposed to something arbitrary like an overhead squat, which is so irrelevant to so many people. And I guess just to give the overhead squat like one kudo, it does test a lot of things at once. So like if somebody can do a nice overhead squat with a dowel rod, that does show you that they have decent ankle mobility, shoulder mobility, balance, hip mobility perhaps. So it's not like the worst thing in the world, but if so many people struggle with it, and then it doesn't really tell you where the issue is, so then you need to do further testing. Okay, well, if we don't have the PVC overhead, can they do it? Okay, well, maybe that's more relevant. So why were we doing that? Oh, we were just trying to knock two things out at once, shoulder mobility and everything else underneath of that. So it's like it can be a useful thing because it does like give you a lot of check marks at one time, but for so many people it's not a good fit, and then we have to go further down the rabbit hole.
This is not an overhead squat hating podcast. It's just a relevant
it's a convenient scapegoat.
Yeah, exactly. Can injuries be prevented? I think most fitness professionals want a screening or an assessment process because they think that you can identify what's going to cause an injury. And many clients are concerned that the weight room is dangerous or that they're going to get hurt in the weight room. But I think if you look at the statistics, you're a lot less likely to get hurt in the gym than you are playing your sport or doing a recreational activity. So, So I guess what is the purpose of the movement screen, I guess, outside of what we mentioned, which is helping you develop a training program? But if it's not that, can it prevent injuries? Can you identify what's going to cause an injury, I guess, is the ultimate question.
Yeah. So as you know, the answer to that question is a pretty conclusive no. And it is confusing from a statistical standpoint or from a research standpoint, because when you look at a lot of these studies, they will say that people who perform poorly on whatever movement screen it is have an increased risk of injury. So it might be, usually there's some sort of total score on the screen. Maybe it's a 14 out of 21 in the case of the FMS. And they'll say people who score less than 14 are 4 times more likely or whatever to sustain an injury over the next X period of time. So that might be true in some contexts with some athletic groups, depending on the sport and the level of play and the gender and all that. But basically that association is very different from predicting on an individual basis who is and isn't going to sustain an injury. So what we think is going to happen is, we're going to do this screen. We're going to find out that they're less than this cutoff score. And then we're going to identify those people and then give them an intervention, and it's going to prevent their injuries. And what actually turns out to happen is that the screen, there were a bunch of people who scored better than whatever your cutoff score was, that all those people also get injured. So, and that's because this movement quality piece is only one probably small component of all of the different things that can affect someone's injury risk. So there's movement, there's also sport skill and strength, there are psychological factors. Age and sex are factors that can't be modified. Previous injury factors in. those are, adding to the piece of the puzzle. There's also factors within the sport. So the playing field, the equipment, the shoes that the people are wearing, the weather outside, and then there's like what happens in that moment of the injury, especially if it's a contact injury, like what was the opposing player doing. So when you think about this whole picture of how injuries happen, you can readily realize that movement quality or competency or the way that somebody moves is just this one small piece of the puzzle. And even everything that I just said didn't even account for training load or like training history and relative preparedness, which is another huge piece of it. So when you realize, oh wow, this injury is really complicated, we probably can't identify on an individual basis who's going to get injured based on the way that somebody moves. Then, like you said, you can start going into other reasons for why this screening process might be beneficial. And again, like you said, it's really just about helping with exercise selection, maybe, again, showing the person what they're capable of, figuring out their starting point, figuring out a baseline so that maybe you can compare to later to show someone the progress that they've made. Hey, remember when we were first starting out, you needed you needed assistance, or you needed to do the drill for the squat and the deadlift. Now look at you, you're deadlifting half your body weight or whatever it is, and kind of show people progress that way. Maybe also if somebody is injured and you need something to compare to from a movement standpoint from their pre-injury, that can be a nice thing to have that baseline assessment to then show that they're back to their baseline, or maybe even exceeding their baseline because they got injured at that initial level of movement. But again, movement is just one piece of this much bigger puzzle. So then the other piece that you mentioned, like, we shouldn't even be really worried about getting, if we're talking about, we're doing this movement screen because we're worried about getting injured in the gym. Like, that is not really something that we need to worry about, because like you said, the injury rates in the gym, the strength training is a very safe movement practice. And many athletic endeavors are, some of them are not. Like football is not a safe sport. The injury rates on football are very high. So like if you compare, I could do 1,000 exposures, I could play football 1,000 times, I would get injured a bunch of times, whatever that high number is, 30 times if I were to play football 1,000 times. If I were to strength train, I would get injured once maybe, or 2 or 3 times. And that's like, those numbers are pretty uniform across bodybuilding, powerlifting, CrossFit, which everybody thinks is dangerous. Like, those numbers are so low. This is really safe, relatively safe.
So what does cause an injury in the gym? I find that people will be like, oh, that exercise is bad for my back, or they have these preconceived notions. But at the same time, maybe I'm introducing someone to deadlift and I make a comment like, yeah, let's make sure we don't go too heavy this first time. And it almost, I don't know if they pick up on it, but it's almost implying that if they were to go heavy, they're going to get hurt. And I don't want them to be thinking that in the back of their head. Like, when I do go heavy deadlifting, it's a higher risk. And the risk-reward ratio is probably a whole nother conversation. There's a person on Instagram, Alec Blennis. I don't know if you follow him, but he puts out really great content. And
he's an amazing follow.
Yeah, and I love all the stuff that he talks about. And he says, like, sometimes those bilateral exercises are the ones you're going to get hurt at because they're the ones that people actually push
right.
really hard, as opposed to like no one usually maxes out their lunge. So what causes an injury in the gym? Are there good exercises? Are there bad exercises? Or are there just exercises you're not prepared for?
Yeah, that's my take on it. It's just things that you're not prepared for. What causes an injury? Like, it can be such a fluky thing. So I agree that it's not really this case of good and bad movements. My thought process around that is kind of like, a movement could only be bad if it was uniformly bad for every single person who could attempt it. And like, I haven't come up with any exercises to put on that list. So there are certain exercises that might not be appropriate for an individual at a given time, but that doesn't make the exercise bad. It's just a poor application of like all exercises are neutral. So what causes an injury, sometimes it's bad luck. Sometimes it's all of those factors just unfortunately co-occurring at the same time of, hey, you got poor sleep, you're stressed, you're underhydrated, you're doing more than you should have done on that day, which is hard to know, and you did one rep too many. So it's like it's not when you, a lot of people, when they look at it, they say, oh, well, he got hurt deadlifting, so deadlifts must be bad, right? And it's not that deadlifts are bad. It's just this person had the unlucky incident of the stars aligning in a bad way. So, I mean, sometimes it can just be poor. Yeah. Especially if you do something like, you drop a plate on your foot. Like, well, that was poor safety measures. But yeah, if you get hurt deadlifting on a weight that you normally do, bad luck. If you get hurt deadlifting on a weight that was more than you normally do, I guess you just found out that you weren't prepared for that. But it is this fine line because we do want to progressively overload. And so, it's the thing, like you mentioned about, telling somebody this like subtle kinesiophobic thing about, hey, we won't want to go too heavy today, or hey, you want to make sure that you keep your back flat so that you don't hurt your back. Like, we mean well with these cues or these words of caution, but it can subtly plant that seed that if you flex your spine, you will get injured, or if you go too heavy, you will get injured. And it's just not that simple. And furthermore, we can adapt to any of those positions, right? So as long as you always lift with the flexed back, and you build it up very gradually, you can adapt. And as long as you lift just a little bit more than you have been doing and don't go ham on a relatively new exercise to you, like, you are minimizing the risk as much as you can. So as trainers, we tend to say these things, again, meaning well, and trying to keep people safe. But at the same time, we might be subtly insinuating these negative beliefs that can like plant in the client's head the seed that could cause them to fear a movement, which we don't want to do.
Yeah, this is such a hard topic to discuss because there's kind of so many nuances to it. When we teach our AdaptX course to people, they often come from like a NASM cert or an ACE cert, and it's taught that movement looks very similar. There's an ideal technique that everyone should adopt, but then when you get and you train hundreds of people, you realize that doesn't really exist. People can RDL with a seemingly perfectly neutral spine and still have lower back pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tough because we're not encouraging you to dismiss the relevancy of technique, but it's just that there's so many things that go into it, and technique kind of exists along a continuum of acceptable and unacceptable, and it's hard to make recommendations.
Yeah, and I had my NASM cert at first too. I've read that book. I've seen the lines that they draw from the back and the shins, and they're saying this has to be very parallel, and if they intersect, this is a recipe for disaster. And then you train 100 people, especially somebody with disability or multiple people with disabilities, and so few people move the same way, so few people move that textbook way, and you begin to realize, oh, well, they're all doing fine. Or maybe, like you said, the people who do move the textbook way have as much back pain as the people who move differently. So we understand why there are these norms or these textbook things. Like, we have to understand that this thing is a squat, right? But then we also have to understand that it is a range where there might be a couple things that we really feel strongly that we don't want to see the squat performed this way or that way. And that's okay, but we can also have this wider range of what would be acceptable and allow for that buffer, and also recognize again that if people train that, if they do that movement that way and they build it up slowly over time, then they can adapt and be robust to that. Whereas somebody else who's just doing it for the first time and looking a certain way, maybe we would want to steer them a little bit away from that.
This could be a good segue into the relationship between flexibility and injury. And so you teach yoga, you teach strength training for yoga. A lot of people associate the practice of yoga with people trying to improve their flexibility and mobility. You could use it simultaneously. But I hear all the time, like, oh, so-and-so hurts, I just need to stretch more. Or I'm sore after the gym, like, I just need to stretch more.
Oh, yeah.
But we also have a lot of dancers at our gym who are more mobile than anyone else, and they always have this perception of stiffness or tightness. They're always trying to stretch their hamstrings, and they're throwing their feet over or they're throwing their legs over their head, and I can't even dream to touch those positions, but I don't have that same perception of tightness. So all of that to say, what's flexibility's role in injury prevention, and maybe what is flexibility's role in general in terms of pain and performance?
So, I mean, you touched on so many good points. Where do we even start? So, like you said, some of the people really value flexibility, right? Especially when you talk to young athletes, they think, I need to stretch more. That's what's going to prevent injuries. I need to stretch more. That's going to help reduce my soreness. And I think what we find is that neither of those things are true. And it doesn't mean stretching is bad or that we shouldn't do it. It just means that it might not be 100% necessary for everybody, or at least not for those particular goals. So also what you mentioned, people who are flexible still perceive that they're very tight. So like hamstrings are one of the most common ones. Everybody in the world almost perceives that they have tight hamstrings. And then you go and test their toe touch or test their supine active straight leg raise, and they can touch their shin to their face or their head to their shins and palm the floor. And it's like, well, clearly you're not inflexible. You might be perceiving tightness, and that is a different thing. So what the research shows is that it's complicated as far as like, especially when you start talking about hypermobility. I would say that like you can certainly find studies that show that less flexibility might be associated with increased risk, but not all studies show that. You can probably also find studies that show that too much flexibility is associated with increased risk. So then you start talking about like those hypermobile yogis who can put their legs behind their head, and maybe that is a risk because you have this access to this position that you don't have as much control over. So then when you start talking about, oh, is yoga the best movement practice for someone who's hypermobile? I mean, it depends on the type of yoga, but if the pursuit is just of more flexibility and the person's already very flexible, then maybe that's not exactly what they need. Maybe they could do yoga, but the yoga should be catered to building some strength into those positions. So, I guess the bottom line, and then I'll ask you what the question was again, is that there are certainly instances, there are sports where you need deep flexibility. Dance, ballet, like, ballerinas or hockey goalies. Like, there are certain sports where you do need to be very flexible, and you do probably need to stretch before the workout to be able to access those ranges of motion within the training session, or stretch every day or often to build up those chronic adaptations of flexibility. You might also be able to get those adaptations from full range of motion strength training, because if you do a Romanian deadlift, a stiff-legged deadlift, that's putting a pretty big stretch on the hamstrings, kind of not that different from if you lie on your back and put your foot up against the wall. So I guess now I'll open that back up to what was the question at the beginning before I went on my rant?
I'm not even sure if there was. It was more so a commentary on should people prioritize flexibility for injury prevention, which I think we both kind of already addressed to a degree.
So maybe, right?
Yeah.
But not universally, and not the way, it's not this number one priority that many people think it is.
Yeah, and not to the degree that it gets in the way. Again, kind of like the mobility or improving these arbitrary metrics of range of motion, as long as it doesn't get in the way of actually training. If someone's spending an hour of their or a half hour of their hour-long session stretching, are they really moving towards the CDC's recommended levels of daily activity?
So if you're thinking about, well, we have an obesity epidemic and so many people don't meet the guidelines for physical activity of 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, 2 days a week of strength training. If you're prioritizing a lot of the time that you are allocating to exercise to flexibility training and it's very low intensity, you're not going to get those adaptations that we're seeking from the strength and aerobic training, So is this the biggest fish to fry? For most people, probably not. There could be a subset of people, maybe older adults, people with chronic conditions who they're not, strength training and aerobic exercise might not be a good fit for them in the immediate term. So the intensity of flexibility stretching could be a good fit, but that's like a relatively smaller niche or subset of people compared to the majority of the people who really just need to be working pretty hard, doing something aerobic and doing something strength. And sure, if they like stretching, have at it for separate from those 150 minutes a week plus 2 sessions of strength training.
Yeah,
or as a very small part
of your workout. Yeah. I'm not too in tune with all of the research on it, but like I would imagine there's certain activities where stiffness and tightness is advantageous to flexibility. For example, like running. I feel like some degree of stiffness is actually good because it's more efficient for transferring force from the ground. Same thing with like being a football lineman. Like you don't want to be hypermobile if someone's about to come like smash into you. You want to be stiff to a degree. So I don't know.
That's kind of my surface level understanding of it too. I haven't delved too deeply into that research, but like apparently from a running efficiency standpoint, if you're stiffer, and there's like our colloquial understanding of stiffness, and then there's the more biomechanical explanation of what stiffness is. But yeah, it could be that like doing a ton of stretching would be counterproductive to that, especially when you think about not needing huge ranges of motion to do an activity like jogging or running, where again, it's task specific and it's individual specific. But it's also probably not going to hurt. The amount of stretching that you actually have to do, the duration of the hold, the intensity of the hold, the frequency of the stretching to probably elicit these negative adaptations is likely more than the 30 seconds that people are doing before their workout. So it's like, people, you can take it to such an extreme and say, well, we should never stretch because it inhibits force and power production. And it's like, that's a transient thing that happens for like 15 minutes, is washed out when you do dynamic stretching afterwards. And unless you're trying to break a world record, you probably don't need to be worried about a 2% drop off in your strength.
Yeah, I feel like that was the big study that got people on like the anti-stretching train. They were like, oh, the force production was decreased in this population of people that stretched before they jumped. And then
Right.
everyone was just like, oh, we shouldn't stretch then because our
Right.
workouts are going to
And
be
that's-
crap.
That's like holding the stretch for 10 minutes and then going immediately into a vertical jump, which isn't
Yeah.
neither how long
You
you
don't
hold
need
it
that
nor
range.
how you would do a session in real life.
Yeah. So going off of hypermobility, conditions like EDS, joint hypermobility, even Down syndrome to a degree where hypotonia and hypermobility are common. Is there specific forms of exercise that are best for these populations? And are there specific forms of exercises that they should maybe shy away from?
I admittedly don't have a ton of experience working with those people besides the yoga practitioners who I work with from a strength training standpoint. My bias is for strength training, right? Especially when you think about like those people have pre-selected them yoga or other types of flexibility practices because they're good at them and they feel good and they like doing them. And I wouldn't say to stop doing those things, but I would say it's really important to develop strength, especially when you do have access to those extreme ranges of motion. So that's my bias for it.
Absolutely. And how can the practice of yoga bias strength instead of flexibility?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting one. And I kind of go back and forth with this because I do have this platform that I co-created with my friend Jenny Rawlings, who's a yoga teacher. And we are all about teaching yoga students and teachers how to strength train. And we kind of do it through this lens of yoga where we like a kettlebell windmill, I guess we call it a windmill, but we kind of make the analogy to this is very similar to triangle pose. And so kind of showing people how we can map these strength training exercises onto yoga poses. But anyway, there are people who just don't want to strength train, right? They want to do yoga. They love yoga. They don't want to go to the gym. They don't want to lift weights. So how do you then make the yoga practice more strengthening? And so that is, we first say, hey, you should really try this thing, strength training. We should do it separate from a yoga practice so that you can just have yoga be for what it's really good for, and then have strength training be separate, and then find experience the benefits of this reciprocity. But if the person were to say, I don't want to do that, I only want to do yoga, then we need to focus on how we can make the practice of yoga itself more strengthening. So that might be doing things like single leg exercises, because, something like chair pose, which is basically a half or quarter squat with your arms overhead in yoga, people will say, well, I'm just going to hold it longer and that's going to get me stronger. And as we know, that's going to get you stronger in the short term. But once you adapt to that and you're holding it longer and longer, a 30-second or 60-second hold is a muscular endurance feat. It's not really building a ton of strength. So finding ways to incorporate more single leg work or incorporate more end range positions where you're building strength in those positions, or incorporating more like isometric contractions, maybe squeezing a yoga block. And then there are certainly yoga poses that are just hard, arm balances, inversions, handstands. So there are ways to, tweak the practice so it's not just about, hey, how deep can we go into this stretch, but how can we focus on poses and implementations of poses that we can find some strength in, which is, it's a different paradigm.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes people think if something's hard, it means it's good for you. Like you'll sometimes hear like a football player who's obviously in the top 1% of the populations in terms of strength say, oh, I went to yoga and it was so hard. It's like, yeah, obviously it was really hard, but that doesn't mean you necessarily have to do it to improve at your sport or whatever. I think sometimes people think that they're like filling in these gaps by finding things they're not good at. Like if you don't run, going out for a run is going to be hard, but that doesn't necessarily mean you need to go out for runs.
Right. So like the lineman in football, yeah, running will be hard, but when do you have to run 2 miles straight? Like
Right.
your position requires, like doing a sled push
Yeah.
would be
5
much
seconds
more,
of effort. Yeah.
yeah, much more similar. And it's not to say that, well, maybe it is to say that you should,
Sure.
no. Then you're like, well, running's bad for linemen. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to say that.
It could be gradually progressed to the point where they could
Yeah,
tolerate it.
you
but-
like you want to find something that you can do for an extended period of time. If you're 300 pounds, like, is running the best thing, or would cycling be better, or an elliptical, or whatever? So yeah, they're finding things that are going to be specific to the task. General aerobic fitness is beneficial for most people. Finding the way to that you can do that comfortably, and that isn't just hard for the sake of it being hard.
Yeah. We talked about movement patterns a little bit in that movement screen discussion. One aspect of movement patterns maybe could be core training. I just want to touch on it real quick. When I first started training people about 10 years ago, I think like Mike Boyle's Functional Training was one of the first books I read, and quickly adopted the old Palloff presses, dead bugs, and bird dogs were going to solve everyone's back pain, and then it just didn't happen the way I was told it was going to happen. I'm like, I was lied to. So I think over the years, I've trended a little bit away from solely static core stuff, or I definitely have trended away from solely stat core stuff to more dynamic stuff. I don't think I fear sit-ups to the degree that I was taught to fear them. And we do a lot of things like side bending and side planks with hip lifts and stuff now.
Yeah,
so
I'm
it's interesting.
on the same trajectory as you.
It's interesting how the fitness industry as a whole kind of moves in these trends. And it's interesting to maybe predict what's going to become irrelevant in the next 5 years and how things are going to change. But maybe we can talk about core training real quick. The balance between static, maybe yoga could be perceived as static poses versus like dynamic core training. How do you program both? Is one better than the other?
Yeah, so I had the same influences and the same process of really focusing on isometrics when I first started to, like yesterday, I was in the gym and I started a new training program for myself, and I did reverse crunches, side bends, and cable twists all in one workout. And if I saw that 5-10 years ago, I would have been horrified. I think, hope maybe 5 years ago, I would have been more up to date. But yeah, so the pendulum for me has definitely shifted back to all movement of the spine is good movement, and so I in my programming I try to give a mix. So like I typically think of it in 3 categories. There's the category number 1 that's purely the static that you mentioned, so your Palloff presses, your side planks, your maybe not suitcase carry, that's a little bit more dynamic, your front plank, your hollow body hold. And then there are exercises that are static at your trunk or torso or core, but then there's dynamic movement happening around them. So things like bird dogs and dead bugs and suitcase carries, like one-arm farmer's carries. So those would be exercises where you're still training the torso, core, whatever you want to call it, in a neutral position or a static position, but then you're resisting perturbations around it from your arms and legs. And then there's the third category that 10 years ago, everybody was saying to swear off because it was not functional or not the role of the core, which is your side bends, your sit-ups, your crunches, your Russian twists. And so I've over the last few years come to appreciate that these exercises are not bad for the spine. They're not going to cause your spine to explode. In fact, they're going to cause your spine to be more robust as long as you progress them gradually. And like when you look back, you see like, well, some people realized that whole anti-movement isometric core training thing was a fad at the time, and they like still were doing your dynamic exercises. And so it's funny just to think about like who the loudest voices were about these things, and where, like you said, where it's headed, and are we going to go back to are we going to, in 5 years from now, are you going to say the isometric exercises are bad? And then in 10 years from now, is it going to repeat all over again? But really, just from my programming standpoint, having a mix of all of those things that's appropriate to the person and to their goals and to their current level.
Yeah, it's interesting that the abdominals are kind of the only muscle group that people train exclusively with isometrics. It's like
Right.
it's like it's a unique muscle where
Right,
everything
like,
was eccentric and concentric minus the abs.
How do you now that I'm 10 years in, I'm like, well, how did I not see that? That would be akin to saying we should only do isometric holds for our bicep curls,
Right.
because the biceps are not meant to, they're meant to resist motion instead of create. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, especially when you look at sports and you see how people move into different positions all the time. And maybe we actually want to be prepared for these positions instead of encountering them in the field of play for the first time. And of course, we know why we were afraid, because there was certain research that was showing that sit-ups and spinal flexion might be injurious, and now we have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of that's those studies weren't as real world as maybe they were made out to be.
The big cadavers didn't necessarily translate.
Exactly. 86,000
really,
flexion cycles or whatever.
That's the number. Make sure you have a ticker keeping track of how many times you round your spine.
I joke with my fiance, like, oh, and like I use a shoehorn to put my shoe on my prosthetic side because my foot doesn't dorsiflex or plantar flex. And I joke that I have like this really long shoehorn, and I'm like, I'm going to save this spinal flexion cycle by using my shoehorn today so I don't have to bend down.
I'm sure your fiance really appreciates that joke. We kind of glanced over it, I guess, in the bio. I mentioned that you were a Paralympic athlete. I guess maybe why did you stop competing? And if Paralympics were as popular or well televised as they are now, do you think you would have pursued a career in athletics further?
Oh, interesting question. So my swimming career kind of neatly aligned with my college swimming career, or my adaptive career. I tried out for the 2012 games, and that was my senior year of college. So mostly the reason I stopped was that I was done college swimming. I felt like I had reached the pinnacle of my career, which was setting a couple of records. I ended up not making the US team that final year, and I was just like, I was ready to move on with my life, which is when I got my diploma in personal training, went back to grad school after that for biomechanics and so on. But yeah, at the time, 2012, which was 12 years ago at this point, like it was a bit of a fringe thing, right? I don't think that we had as many like Paralympians in commercials during the Super Bowl, like the way that it is now. Like we're out there more in the public eye, which I think is really cool. But yeah, it felt like my career had just reached its natural conclusion at that time. I had just been diagnosed with ulcerative colitis a couple years before the end of my career, so I was having some pretty wicked digestive issues that resulted in me ending up getting my colon removed in 2015. So like would have had to stop swimming then. But anyway, about 6 months ago, I joined a master's swim team with a friend and just had my second competition in this decade. And like, I'm not breaking any records, but I'm pleasantly surprised with how much I've been able to recover my ability. Like, I never thought that I would get as fit as I am now again, like after college. So it's been really fun to get back into it on a more recreational level without the intention of like trying to pursue a really elite level, and just doing it a couple times a week for fun.
Was that hard to maybe not compare to previous abilities, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still falling into that trap for sure of like going on collegeswimming.com and looking at my I entered the 200-yard freestyle in this meet. I didn't know what my time was going to be, so I looked at my college times. I added a couple seconds and I thought, well, maybe I'll be close. I wasn't. I ended up being much slower than that. So honestly, that was a little discouraging to, I guessed a time that I thought would be conservative and it ended up not even be conservative enough. So, it can be hard. And, I was a little bit down just on that event, the meet. I swam like 6 events and 4 of them were better than the previous time that I'd done in December. I was a little discouraged like the day of, and then the next day I was like looking at the times again. I was like, oh my God, like I did better this meet than I did like 3 months ago in all of the events that I duplicated. Like, this is awesome. I'm making progress. I'm 34 years old. I should try to forget what I did in my 20s because it's just no longer realistic anymore. And I should just compare myself to myself in my present 34-year-old status.
Yeah. During college, how did your strength training differ as an amputee? And can you make any general recommendations for a personal trainer who might be working with a unilateral amputee?
Yeah. So strength training was, I joked that I did it to get a leg up on my competition. And I hired a personal trainer my sophomore year of college. And that I really did feel like that made a huge difference in my performance. It also inspired me to then go and become a personal trainer myself. But the workouts that we did at the time, it was very much like a body part split. It was not super athletic oriented. I mean, there were certainly some things, but it was more of like your bodybuilding program mapped onto an athlete as opposed to like what I would consider to be more sports performance training. And so my personal trainer and I kind of figured out what was going to work best for me, right? And that was a lot of single leg exercises. It was a lot of like taking the prosthesis off and balancing on one leg and honestly, I wasn't even doing anything really heavy like squatting and deadlifting. It wasn't until I then became a personal trainer and realized that I could do like heavy barbell. I could do those things on one leg. So it didn't do a great job of working with my disability. It kind of just worked around the not having a one leg. And so now that I'm, in the last 10 years since I became a personal trainer and started trying to figure out, well, how can I train my affected side better? It's been a more gradual exploration of what exercises can I do on both sides, or how can I limit the range of motion so that I can train both sides at the same time or independently or whatever. So it's like this constant trial and error process of, hey, does this work? That doesn't feel great. Hey, let me try this other thing. And like, I'm still finding new exercises or ways of doing things that I previously might have poo-pooed, or maybe I tried it before and it didn't work for me then, but it works for me now. So like, my best recommendation would just be to try so many different things to find out what works for the person. And like, what works for me as an amputee might not work for another person as an amputee. I also, like, my limb difference is congenital. So I was born missing my leg, and I have like a kind of funkier hip anatomy, which more or less prevents me from doing like something like a deadlift from the floor because I can't get into a good position in the bottom. But like, I can do rack pulls or I can do RDLs, but maybe a different amputee, either above knee or below knee, would have no problem with that. So like, it's not necessarily even taking my advice as this is what works for me and applying it to somebody else with an above the knee amputation. It's really just like, what are all of the ways that we can adapt a squat, a deadlift, a lunge, or whatever it is, and then trying those things out and finding what works for the person.
Yeah,
which is a non-answer, because it's like, I can't tell you.
Yeah,
but like,
no, it's not.
And it's co-creating that with the person, and just being open to experimentation.
I mean, you did make great recommendations when you reviewed our amputation module for the AdaptX course, like three years ago. I just wanted some practical advice, and You made great comments about rack pulls versus deadlifts from the floor, maybe Smith machine squats,
Yeah,
taking out some of those stability issues.
and that's the other, like Smith machine squats. I'm sure 10 years ago you probably, or I
Yep,
imagine,
same thing.
would have pooed it
Yeah.
because those functional training gurus were saying that was not functional. And now, like, I love Smith machine for myself because I have a little bit of instability in my balance, right? So being able to get some external stability is really helpful for me to then load that muscle. But I, like, not even just for myself, I would give Smith machine squats to anybody who wasn't, didn't have a goal of free bar squatting, or maybe even they did, but just building strength and building muscle is functional in and of itself. And then you can layer on the balance component afterwards if you want to. But it just, I was like so dogmatic about, Smith machine isn't good because it's creating the stability for you. Like, there's so much benefit to that, that it doesn't have to be this black and white either or. It can be both. And especially for somebody who is an amputee or anybody, it can be a great thing to try. Whereas I would have totally said no way a while ago.
Yeah, same thing. We don't have a Smith machine, but I've seen people be able to squat with like a lot more forward knee translation. So maybe they're getting a better quad stimulus when they have that orientation of the weight. So
I thought, it's constrained to this fixed bar path that's no good. And then I finally tried it out. I'm like, wow, I can put my feet farther forward if I want so that I don't need ankle dorsiflexion. I can do it farther behind. I can do it front, back. I can do it Zercher. Like, I can do it Zercher and basically lean back on the bar for all this stability and really focus on pushing through my prosthetic side. And it's just like such a game changer. So yeah, but not everybody has a Smith machine at their gym. So you try to replicate, like, you can replicate that just by, if you have a squat rack and you don't mind scraping some of the paint off of it, sliding a bar up and down on the rack, like, gives you that same, I can lean back against this.
yeah, don't give anyone at my gym an idea of doing that. I do not want to do this. As an adaptive athlete, did you want to work with adaptive athletes as a personal trainer?
Yeah, I got inquiries, somewhat regularly from people reaching out through my website and, I'm an amputee, I would love to work with you. And I occasionally take them on, and sometimes because it's not necessarily my number one expertise, like, sometimes I refer them. I have a couple other friends who are amputees and personal trainers, and like, if I receive the email in a moment where I have 8 tests to grade, I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna refer you to my friend who I think will be a better fit. So sometimes I like working with them, and sometimes I defer to people with more expertise.
Is that lived experience essential for understanding how to train amputees?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it helps, like, I can relate on a personal level, but I think if you're able-bodied, but you have a lot of experience working with people in an adaptive context, like, you can build that to the point of, like, I would much sooner trust you with an adaptive athlete than I would trust myself. Like, you've been doing it for a long time. Like, the materials you produce are so awesome. Like, I have my own experience of lifting myself for 19 years, but that's only N=1. So I wouldn't necessarily know the first thing about training an upper extremity amputee, or but I have a friend who's missing his arm at the elbow, and he actually found me on the internet before we met in person. We like ran into each other at a rock climbing gym and became friends. But he was like, "Oh my God, you're Travis Pollen." I was blessed. I was touched to be recognized in the wild. That's like one of 2 times that's ever happened. But anyway, he was like, "I saw, I follow you on Instagram. You really inspired me to get into the gym and try things because I saw you doing it." And it's like, well, totally different adaptations between upper body and lower body, but him seeing me doing things was enough to get him motivated to try things. So I think that's the cool thing. Like, maybe I don't give myself enough credit of, like, yeah, I could figure that out because I've adapted for myself. Anytime you work with anybody, nobody can do everything to the Olympic level the first time they try it. So there's always an adaptation that's occurring, regardless of what the reason is. It might not be a disability. So I guess my long answer is, I think regardless of whether you're disabled yourself, we all have experience adapting things in the gym. And so I think anybody could probably figure these things out. But having more experience figuring it out for a specific population will make it easier.
Yeah, you used the word inspire during that you motivated him to get involved. Have you had to deal with any glorified inspiration narrative sort of issues? What do you think about people calling you an inspiration?
Yeah, I kind of leaned into that when I first got onto the internet. A lot of my social media presence was showing off like cool single leg exercises or like feats of strength in the gym. And I enjoyed the attention. It helped me build a little bit of a following online. I subsequently realized that it wasn't the type of audience that I necessarily wanted to build, from a standpoint of, hey, I want to educate other fitness enthusiasts, personal trainers about exercise science, rehab science, and people who follow me for those cool tricks aren't necessarily interested in learning about the science of exercise or rehab. So that I guess I got away from it a little bit, but maybe I still do it a little bit sometimes now too, just for fun. So I guess it's a fine line of, I like the attention. I don't mind that if it helps me get a few more likes and follows on Instagram. Like that doesn't bother me, but it can become over the top of, what's your excuse, and if he can do it, whatever. I wouldn't say I have too much of a negative association with it, but it definitely, it didn't, when I was really big into that, what I realized was it wasn't the type of follower that I was really trying to attract.
Yeah, I get that. I think I've probably been following you for at least 9 or 10 years. I'm not sure when you started putting out content, but it never seemed that way to me. Like, you never really leaned into the, if I can do it, why aren't you doing it type of narrative.
I wouldn't do that, but people would ascribe that to me in the comments or whatever. Yeah. And I don't think it bothered me. I also have pretty thick skin. Not that anybody was trying to insult me. People were inspired by that. Yeah. And it does get into like the what's it called? Fitspiration, or like
inspiration porn sort of
inspiration
thing.
porn. And it's do I really want to be fostering that? I don't know. But on a personal level, like it never got to me.
Yeah. One question that we ask all the guests is whether they have any recommendations to making the fitness industry as a whole more accessible, or just fitness in general accessible.
Yeah. So this is interesting, and maybe this is like maybe not everybody would share this opinion, but like when I approach a fitness setting, I just want to be treated as similarly as everyone else. Like I don't want special favors or special treatment. Like I want my experience to be as typical as it can be. And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's like a flaw, like a personality flaw, or because like I recognize that I'm different, but I aspire not to be. But I don't know. I find that if I can find the way to do it that's as similar as the way that everybody else is doing it, then I feel most included. So that's not always going to be entirely possible. But I guess I gravitate towards the activities that I don't need modifications for. And like that might not be possible for everybody. But that's I guess my point is, like, if we can not make a big deal out of modifying something, then that is what works best for me.
Yeah, no, I think someone could hear that, a personal trainer could hear that and just take away that it doesn't necessarily have to be drastically different training someone with a disability than someone without. In many cases, there's more similarities and differences, and some people might want to be included amongst the masses. Other people might feel more comfortable in sub-separate environments, but ultimately it's up to the individual. So if you were to go into a gym and say, I want to take the traditional CrossFit class or I want to take that group class, it's up to the trainer to figure out what modifications are necessary, or up to you and the trainer to figure out what modifications are necessary. But
and that I think is really important. That last thing you brought up. So like I've been doing CrossFit for about a year, and I had dabbled before, but like I'm actually going to a CrossFit gym now, and the trainer knows that I'm an exercise science professor. So I think he gives me maybe a little bit more free. I don't know if he gives me more free reign or not, but like I'll ask him if, you know, do you have a suggestion, or he'll volunteer a suggestion, and that's great. Like us being able to co-create, like that's the workout on the board, and here's how I'm going to modify it. Or do you have any ideas for how to modify it? Like just that conversation, that comfortability of, hey, like I have an idea for how I'm going to do it, and he'll let me go. Or he has an idea for how, you know, maybe I modified it, but I made it easier than he wanted me to make it. So the next time he says, hey, you know, you could try this next time, or have you ever tried this, or whatever. So having that two-way exchange of like, I'm the expert in my own body. He is the fitness expert and the CrossFit expert. How can we collaborate to find what's going to work best for me? That's great. And recognizing both expertises.
Well, I think we covered a bunch of great topics. I think hopefully we did a good job of providing the nuance within each of them. They're very case dependent, which is sometimes tough, but at the same time, maybe reassuring to a degree that there doesn't always have to be perfect standards. Movement doesn't have to be perfect, but appreciate everything that you've done for me over the last few years, just staying in touch and always being willing to answer questions that I have. And I'm glad to get you on the show to share some of the work that you're doing. If people want to find your content, we'll put it in the show notes, but where would you recommend that they go?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure for years knowing you and being able to exchange information, and I learned from you, I think, just as much or more than
Thanks.
You learned from me. So if people want to reach out, my website is a good place to find me. There's a contact form on there. It's just my name, travispollen.com. I'm also active on Instagram to an extent. My handle is fitness_pollinator. So those are probably the two best places to reach me. And then if anybody was interested in working with me, I do some individual remote training, and then I also have the group yoga strength training platform that's called Strength for Yoga.
Yeah.
And that's that website, and then the same Instagram handle.
Awesome. Well, Travis, thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.